Wow, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kevin and Sunny, for inviting me. And I'm really excited to be here. So, my name's Keziah, and this is It's Not Your Job to Love Your Job. A couple years ago, I started my very first developer job in the industry. And one afternoon, I was sitting on my couch, my laptop on my lap, on my computer, and I was listening to our company's weekly all hands call. It was a remote first company, so I was working out of Florida at the time. And it was a typical all hands call. So we talked about, I don't know, different things that the teams are doing, announcements. We were planning a trip to Ireland later in the summer, just typical like all team meeting stuff. Suddenly, I was listening to the call, I was kind of zoning out, and then I heard this phrase that I never expected my CEO to say: 2 weeks of runway. This is not something you ever want to hear from anyone who works with you. The CEO was talking about how there were times within our company's history where we might have only had about 2 weeks of money left to keep the company running, but somehow they always pulled through and raised enough money to keep going, which is good because, I still had a job, obviously. But it wasn't something I was expecting to hear. I had no idea at the time that the company was in such bad shape. Hearing this phrase gave me a lot of anxiety. I started to doubt myself. I started to doubt whether or not I belonged in this position. And I didn't want to believe that anything was wrong with the company that I was working at. Especially since, I felt so lucky as a junior engineer to have a job in the first place. I had a remote job. I was able to travel. Here's a picture of me in Medellin, Colombia. I had a job. I was able to travel. I was doing exciting things. I was getting paid well. I had my dream job. So to hear suddenly that we weren't in a financially good place, it was really scary for me. I liked my job and I felt very lucky, especially as a junior engineer. So even when red and yellow flags kept popping up throughout my time there, I just kind of ignored them and pushed them to the side. For example, there were times when even when we had very little runway left, when we had very little money in the bank, we kept hiring people. I realized that I wasn't really progressing in my career. I wasn't really going anywhere. Later on, I realized that the job I had didn't really align with my values. We got paid late a couple times, which is extremely frustrating and which is definitely a red flag for any company. The company was taking really huge financial risks, starting new programs, new initiatives that we couldn't really afford to do. There was some groupthink going on. It felt like it was really hard for us to really disagree with things that were going on with the company. I didn't really have an important role at the company. The engineering team was just me and one other junior engineer. So I felt like the work I was doing wasn't really contributing to the rest of the company, and I was just given a lot of busy work. And also, I had a manager, but it wasn't really the equivalent of what you would expect an engineering manager to be. Because of that lack of management, I didn't really have the career progression that I would expect. So one day, about a year after that call, I ended up getting laid off. And I posted this tweet to Twitter. And I'm sure most of you, if you're on Twitter, you've seen a tweet like this. It's like, hey, I lost my job. This is what I do. Please help me find a new job, right? This was actually posted the very day that I found out I was getting laid off, March 4th of last year. After it happened, I just kept thinking to myself, what the hell happened? How did I get into this situation where I was at a job that I knew that I really loved, but I just kept ignoring the red signs? How did I let my affection, my love for my job, get in the way of basic common sense and looking after myself? A little about me. I know Justin Matt told you about me, but the slide's here, so I'm going to tell you about myself again. So I'm a web developer. I'm a front-end engineer. I'm a digital nomad. I love to travel. I love remote work. Just wanted me to mention some of the places I've been: Colombia, Mexico. Where else have I been? When I used to teach, I taught in Saudi Arabia and Spain. So travel's a big thing for me. I run the Juniors in Tech newsletter, which is basically a weekly roundup of career advice, junior jobs, and just a bunch of other things just for people like us who are just starting our careers in tech. And I'm on Twitter way too much. My username is Keziyah L. Please don't follow me, you will be disappointed. So this talk is, it's not your job to love your job. And maybe some of you are thinking, well, okay, duh. Like most of us don't really like our jobs anyway. And that's true to some extent. Only 34% of workers in the US and 11% of workers in the UK are engaged at work. So a lot of people don't really like their jobs, right? But even if you don't like your job, we kind of have a tendency to prioritize our jobs and to kind of commit to our jobs in a way that gets in the way of other things in our lives, right? For example, 38% of workers in one survey missed a child's important event for work. 24% of working parents say their kids have asked them to work less. In the UK, you all work 2.5 more weeks more per year than other countries in the EU, than the average EU worker. Why is that? And you all only 1/3 of you have found a good work-life balance. So I was really kicking myself when I got laid off, trying to figure out what happened, how I got myself to that point. And I wanted to really analyze just what happened. Like, how did I get myself to a point where I was so attached to a job that I couldn't really see it for what it really was? And I wanted to figure out 3 things. Why did I stay at this job? How did they keep me at this job? And what would I do now if I could go back in time and tell past Keziyah, if I could give her some advice? It's basically what we're going to talk about today. Why did I stay at this job? What is the psychology behind staying at a job that you know is not good for you? What's going on in our minds when we try to push away those red flags and ignore them? What are some strategies that employers use, knowingly or not, to keep workers around? And what advice would I give to you or to my past self to prevent this from happening again? So let's talk about why I stayed at this job. I can hear some of you laughing. I'm sure you've seen this comic by Casey Green. In the first part of the comic, there's a dog sitting at a coffee table enjoying a cup of coffee while their building is literally burning down. In the second part, they're saying this is fine, because apparently being in a burning building and having coffee is fine. So this dog kind of reminds me of myself. If you can think of the burning building as like my old job, like I could see the flames around me, I'm inhaling the smoke, I can feel the heat, but I'm still just sitting there in my job saying, oh, everything's fine, we got paid late, whatever, it's fine. I wanted to do more research into the psychology of that. Psychologists have studied how we create illusions to deal with the difficulty of reality. So there are times when we do have a psychological need to believe that everything is fine, even when it's not. Shelley Taylor and Jonathan Brown identified a cognitive bias called the positive illusion. It's basically a cognitive bias where you think positively about yourself and about your situations and your surroundings, and you do that in order to maintain your mental health. It's kind of like if you were to face the reality, your mental health would suffer. So in order to avoid that, you try to create a positive illusion about what you're experiencing. And they identified that positive illusions have 3 characteristics. The first is unrealistically positive self-evaluations. So people tend to think highly of themselves compared to others. When we think of ourselves, we exaggerate our positive traits and we kind of ignore our negative traits. Exaggerated perceptions of control. So we think of situations that are completely out of control or that are completely up to chance, and we exaggerate our effect on those situations. So, for example, I think there was some study where they had 2 people working as a team to try to, I guess, roll a die or flip a coin to get a certain result in order to win the game. And people found, this psychologist found that people preferred to roll the dice themselves instead of letting their partner roll the dice because they decided that they had a greater effect on the outcome of the game, even though it was totally up to chance. And the third characteristic is unrealistic optimism, which is basically the idea that we are unrealistically we have unrealistic optimism about our futures. We generally think that more good things than bad things will happen to us in the future. So positive illusion is what makes us think everything is fine, even when even when it's not. And again, these are illusions that we create in order to maintain our mental health. So when we look back at this comic, we can kind of understand why this dog thinks that everything is fine, even though, they're literally going to die if they stay in that burning building, right? Because if they were to face the reality of, okay, I'm in a burning building, I need to get out, they would probably freak out, right? It would cause harm to their mental health. So it's easier for them to think that everything's fine. And I thought about myself and my previous job, and I realized that I think it's why I stuck with this job, even though I knew deep down it wasn't good for me. So even though I saw all these red flags, I was still optimistic. I still really thought that everything was going to be okay. Think about the last time you were in a situation, a bad situation, a relationship, a job, whatever it was, where you knew things weren't going well, but you still held on for some reason. You still thought to yourself, everything's going to be okay, things will turn around, etc. This is how the comic ends. We don't often see this when it's used as a meme on social media. But basically, the dog is continuing to drink their coffee and says, I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently. And then that's okay, things are going to be okay. And in the very last panel, their face is getting melted off. So remember that positive illusions basically shape our mental health. Admitting the reality of what was going on at my job probably would have been detrimental to my mental health. In fact, there were times when I did admit to myself what was going on, and I couldn't sleep, my anxiety went up. It was just really difficult for me. And then a little bit of time passed, and things got better. I was like, okay, I'm not gonna lose my job. We're going to Ireland next month. Everything's fine. And, it was easier for me to believe that everything was just going to be okay. All right, so now I understand a little about why I stayed at this job that I really shouldn't have stayed at. I want to talk about what strategies employers might use, knowingly or not, to kind of keep workers sticking around. I think that it involves three things. You have to get your employees to believe in the company. You have to get them to care about the company, and then to believe the company cares about them also. You also have to get them to fight for and sacrifice for the company. So getting them to believe in the company involves something called a hero story. A startup hero story is some sort of positive or uplifting narrative about a startup's origins and its founders and the company and the operations. This is something you'll see on like a website's about page or in any kind of media, in a blog post, in any kind of marketing, that sort of thing. I think that startup hero stories have three characteristics: humble origins, an exaggerated impact on the world, and a minimization of harm done to society. Let's look at some examples. Humble origins is basically started from the bottom, now we're here, right? You hear of a lot of startups that start in someone's garage or in someone's dorm room, or it was started by a person while they were homeless, etc. Rags to riches stories are rare, and we're attracted to that kind of exceptionalism. Hero stories also promote the idea that they have an exaggerated impact on the world. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of startups that kind of promote this idea that they're going to revolutionize that or disrupt something else or fundamentally change something. For example, Lambda School. This is a coding boot camp that I do not like. And they claim to be pioneering a new model of higher education. Let's look at another example. Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes once said to her staff, "You are all a part of something that is a revolution. What higher purpose is there?" I mean, I can think of like 30 other higher purposes than making a machine that doesn't even work, but I don't know. The final characteristic of a hero story is the minimization of harm to society. So hero stories will they want us to think that the company existing is a net good in the world. They're usually not, right? This is from Away, the luggage company. It says on their About page that they've partnered with a nonprofit that does peace building. Sounds nice, I guess. This is Facebook. This is a blog written by Mark Zuckerberg, in which he said, "It's not enough to simply connect the world. We must also bring the world closer together," which sounds wonderful. He's trying to make it seem like Facebook is a net good in the world, and we know that it's not, right? So these are the three characteristics that make up a hero story: humble origins, exaggerated impact on the world, and a minimization of harm to society. Hero stories are really important because they attract, it's marketing basically. It's good PR, they attract investors, and they attract talent as well, right? 9 out of 10 people are willing to earn less money to do more meaningful work. And 42% of workers want to work for a company that has a positive impact on the world. So we like hero stories because we want to be a part of our story. And companies may or may not know this, maybe they do, but having a really good hero story is a way to attract talent and get them to stay, even when they shouldn't. So hero stories aren't necessarily bad, but I want us all to be careful about not drinking the Kool-Aid, because that's exactly what I did at my last job. Oh, this is cringeworthy. So I believed in the executives at this company before I even met them. I knew about their story. I followed them on Twitter. I was really inspired by what they were doing. So on the very first day of my job, they flew me out to California for some all-team meeting. And there was a reporter there who was doing a report on our company for a podcast. And she asked something about whether or not we're worried about how things are going with the company. And I chimed in on my very first day and said, I trust founder one's name and founder two's name. And it's cringeworthy for me to think about that because I literally did not know these people. But I felt like I could trust them because of the story that I had been told about them. So the next time you come across a company's hero story, I want you to practice being more critical and not taking everything at face value. I'm sure there are companies out there that you admire, that you really want to work for. Maybe you follow the CEO on Twitter. Maybe the CEO makes really good dad jokes on Twitter or something. But I want you to just be critical of companies and remember that hero stories are, it's marketing basically. So after you get employees to believe in your company, you have to get them to care about the company and to believe that the company cares about them as people. This is what I'm calling enforced familiarity. It's the idea that when companies promote the idea that everyone at the company cares for one another and that the company as an entity cares about the employees and that they have the employees' best interests in mind. And it's okay to care about your boss or your coworkers or whatever. It's totally natural. More than 50% of tech workers have a work BFF, and you're 1.4 times more likely to receive praise if you have a work BFF. And also 70% of workers say having a friend at work is crucial to a happy, healthy work life. Here are some examples of enforced familiarity. Describing colleagues as family, which I really hate. Talking about self-care and work-life balance. Encouraging bringing your whole self to work. Claiming to care about diversity and inclusion. Encouraging transparency and openness. And having company values like compassion, empathy, kindness, or whatever. Most of these are good, except the first one. The first one is very bad. Don't ever do the first one. The rest of them are really good, and I don't mind it. And I like seeing this on company about pages. That's good. The problem is they may not reflect the reality of how companies are actually run. This is from NPM's About page, and I just want to, they just have a couple paragraphs about like what they believe in or whatever. I just want to highlight the parts that kind of talk about this enforced familiarity that I'm talking about. Not a typical work hard, play hard startup. Taking care of ourselves, our families, and one another. Sustainable approach to work and life. Compassion is our strategy. That all sounds great. We know that's not true if you follow the NPM layoff story from last year. This is an article from the Register on the layoffs. Layoffs always suck, right? But a lot of people who formerly used to work at NPM had a problem with how the layoffs were done. One developer advocate, former developer advocate for NPM said that he thought there was a disconnect between the company's values and its behavior. Another source told the Register that they had an all-hands meeting and encouraged people to speak up and ask honest questions, and the following week they were fired. That's not a very compassionate way to treat your employees. You shouldn't fire people for asking questions at an all-hands meeting. I want you to remember two things about enforced familiarity. The first is that more familiarity often means fewer boundaries, right? We have fewer boundaries with people who we're more familiar with, who we're closer to. And fewer boundaries often means exploitation. The second thing is that caring about your colleagues and your managers and your CEO is fine, but you can't ignore the power dynamic. And finally, your employer can't. Your bosses as people can care about you, but your employer, the company as an entity, cannot care about you, right? Because the company itself is not a person. And the only thing the company itself cares about is the bottom line, right? So let's talk about the final thing. Once you have people believing in your company, once you kind of make it seem like you care about them, you can get them to sacrifice for you. I'm calling this noble sacrifice. This is when employers pressure workers into sacrificing for the greater good of the company. Things like working long hours with no extra pay, doing extra work, getting paid less, etc. This is an article by April Glazer in Slate about Kickstarter's union busting. It says, employees joining Kickstarter sometimes take a salary that is lower than market rate because they believe in Kickstarter's mission and want to lend their labor for a meaningful cause. They're sacrificing their pay for this company. I would never do that, but kudos to them. This is the Away piece, the piece about Away luggage that was published in The Verge last month. If you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. It's very eye-opening. In this piece, they talked about how the customer support reps for Away, they were basically demeaned and berated by the CEO. They were emotionally abused. They were denied time off, all kinds of things. One of the support reps said that she was overworked and underpaid, but something in her wanted to keep going. I wanted to move closer to work so I could work more, but I couldn't afford it. She believed in the company so much that even though she was being overworked and underpaid, she still wanted to sacrifice more of herself for this company. We're asked to sacrifice so many things for work, right? Not just our time, our labor, or money. Sometimes we're asked to sacrifice our right to raise a family. This is a headline about one person who was discriminated against for getting pregnant while working at WeWork. Sometimes we sacrifice our own mental health. This is a story about an Uber engineer who committed suicide after complaining about job stress. Sometimes we sacrifice our safety. This is Susan Fowler's blog post from a couple years ago about her experiences at Uber with sexism and sexual harassment. Sometimes we sacrifice our values. You may have heard recently that several GitHub employees resigned after GitHub signed a contract with ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement in the US, which is, of course, keeping kids in cages at the US-Mexico border. And sometimes we sacrifice just our ability to be ourselves and to just exist in the world of tech without being discriminated against. This is a Medium blog post that was published in November, in which Facebook employees talk about racism against employees of color at Facebook. So is it worth it? Is all of this sacrifice for your job worth it? I'm going to say yes, actually. It's worth it for your boss. It's worth it for the CEO. It's worth it for the shareholders. It's never worth it for you. It's never worth it for us, right? So that's how they kept me around. And I want to quickly talk about what I would do if I could go back in time and talk to myself and give myself some advice. I made this presentation for you all, for the public, but I mostly made it for myself as a way of kind of thinking about what happened and trying to, I guess, learn from it. So what would I do now? It's 4 simple things. The first is be a little cynical. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't drink your company's Kool-Aid. It's very high in sugar and it's bad for you. But also just be a little cynical. You don't have to believe everything your company says. You can believe in their mission, you can believe in their story, but just always keep like kind of a side eye on them, Prepare for the worst. You never know what's going to happen. I had no idea I was going to get laid off. I figured it would had the possibility of happening, but when it happened, I had no idea what to do, and I was freaking out. So if you have a job, or when you get a job, prepare for the worst. You never know what's going to happen. Your colleagues are your community. Watch each other's back. Your colleagues could be your people on your team, people at work, people on Twitter, people at your local meetup. Lean on each other, help each other out. And finally, put yourself first. Love yourself more than your job, because your number one job is to take care of yourself. And your other jobs are to go to work and get paid and be the best junior developer that your company has ever seen, and take care of your family and have a good work-life balance and make some money and spend it on whatever you want to spend it on. I spend it on like ice cream and music festivals. It's not your job to be a cheerleader for your company. It's not your job to work yourself to death. It's not your job to sacrifice yourself for your company. And it's not your job to love your job. Thank you so much.